They said my cabin was on the market before I'd even thought about selling it. One morning, I drove up to find strangers walking my property with a realtor, snapping photos as if I didn't exist. The HOA had quietly taken it upon themselves to decide my future, listing my home as if it were theirs to offer. I felt violated, furious, and humiliated, like a guest in my own life. So I did something they never expected. I locked the gates, posted a bold sign of my own, and turned. Their power play into my declaration of war. But how far would the HOA go once I dared to push back? I had always envisioned the cabin as a refuge, not just from the city's noise, but from the constant demands of everyday life. It sat tucked away at the end of a gravel road, framed by tall pines that swayed in the wind and shielded me from curious eyes. For years, I treated it like a sanctuary, the kind of place where you could breathe deeper, hear your own thoughts, and feel a sense of belonging that was hard to come by anywhere else. When I first bought it, the small HOA that oversaw the community barely registered as more than a formality. Their rules seemed harmless, their presence almost invisible, and I signed their agreements without a second thought. Like most people, I figured they were there to keep things neat, perhaps to ensure property values remained steady, and little else. Life settled into a rhythm. Weekends at the cabin became a ritual, stacking firewood, sipping coffee on the porch. As the sun cracked through the trees and chatting with the occasional neighbor about the weather or fishing, the place didn't just feel like a home. It felt like an anchor, grounding me in a world that often moved too fast. That's what made the community seem welcoming at first glance. The streets were quiet, the lawns were kept, and even though the HOA sent out newsletters about seasonal maintenance, it all seemed distant, almost irrelevant. They were just words on paper, and I never imagined they would one day crawl into the heart of my life and try to tear it apart. Still, there were hints, small moments that didn't feel important at the time. A neighbor is complaining about the look of someone's mailbox. A reminder email from the HOA about the proper shade of paint for front doors. A whispered frustration about someone who had dared to leave their RV in the driveway a day too long. These were things I brushed off, telling myself every neighborhood had its quirks. After all, what was the harm in a few rules if it kept things orderly? But beneath the surface, there was something more. A quiet hunger for control, hidden, under the pretense of protecting property values. For a while, I remained untouched by it. I paid my dues, followed the basics, and kept to myself. The HOA, in return, left me alone. At least, that's how it seemed. My focus was on enjoying the cabin, improving little things year by year. A new fence around the garden, a fresh coat, of stain on the deck, a path carved out by hand toward the lake. I took pride in the space, not to impress anyone, but because it felt like mine in the truest sense of the word. It was my investment, my labor, and my heart poured into those walls, but peace like that rarely lasts where control is currency. Slowly, the tone in the community began to shift. I noticed new faces on the HOA board, people less interested in neighborly chats and more eager to remind others about bylaws. Their language grew sharper, their warnings more insistent. It wasn't just about keeping the grass trimmed or the trash bins hidden anymore. There was an edge to it, as though they were testing boundaries, pushing to see how far they could go before someone resisted. And when no one did, the board grew bolder. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to be their next project. They had circled in on me, not because I had broken any rules, but because my property, my cabin, was something they believed they could use to prove their authority. What had once been a place of quiet mornings and long, uninterrupted weekends was about to become the stage for a power struggle I never asked for. And as the tension built, the cabin that had always felt like my refuge was about to turn into something else entirely, a battleground. The first sign of trouble didn't come with a loud bang or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, folded neatly inside a white envelope taped to my front gate. At first, I thought it was just another newsletter, maybe a reminder about lawn, maintenance, or upcoming community events. But as I tore it open, the words inside left me stunned. The HOA was expressing concern about the condition and accessibility of my property. According to them, my gate was a barrier to potential buyers and unwelcoming to community standards. Buyers? I wasn't selling. I hadn't so much as mentioned the idea. Yet here was this letter, written in official tones as if I violated something, for daring to secure my own land. I brushed it off at first, assuming it was a mistake or some clerical overreach. But within a week, another notice arrived. This one carried a fine. A fine for non-compliance with property accessibility guidelines. I read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Accessibility guidelines? What guideline could justify charging me for keeping my own gate locked? The absurdity might have been laughable, if not for the number in bold at the bottom of the page. $200. Due immediately. Anger simmered beneath my skin, but I told myself it was a one-time thing. Pay the fine, I thought. And maybe they'll leave me alone. Except paying would mean admitting I had done something wrong. And I hadn't. I refused. That's when the letters began multiplying. First one a week, then two, then three. Each new notice piled another charge onto the last, inflating the number like a balloon about to burst. They accused me of obstructing property access, failing to comply with unstated policies, and even neglecting community harmony. And then came the kicker. The HOA claimed they had the right to schedule tours of my property for prospective community buyers. It was written plainly, as though it were normal, as though my home was just another asset in their portfolio. The gall of it hit me like a punch to the chest. I wasn't just being fined. I was being told my property wasn't entirely mine anymore. The first time I actually caught them in the act, it didn't feel real. I had driven up early one Saturday morning, expecting to spend a quiet day repairing the fence near the woods. Instead, I saw a car parked crookedly near my driveway, doors open, a group of strangers milling about. They carried clipboards, taking notes and snapping photos of my cabin as though it were a museum exhibit. At the center of it all stood a realtor gesturing toward the porch like she was selling the dream of quiet country living. My stomach twisted as I realized what I was seeing. They were touring my home. I didn't shout. I didn't storm down the hill. I stood there, hidden by the trees, my hands clenched so tight they ached. The humiliation burned hotter than the anger. These strangers thought I had invited them, that my cabin was up for grabs, that their curiosity permitted them to tread where they didn't belong. The realtor's voice carried across the yard. The cabin has been well maintained, and the HOA is ensuring a smooth transition for any potential buyers. Transition. Buyers. My cabin, the place I had poured my time, money, and soul into, was being casually handed around as if my signature on the deed meant nothing. When they finally drove off, leaving tire marks in the gravel like a scar. Across my property, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The HOA wasn't just harassing me anymore. They were trying to rewrite the reality of ownership. And if they were bold enough to stage tours without my consent, what would stop them? From going further? I locked the gate that day, but it didn't feel like enough. My cabin had always been my sanctuary, but suddenly it felt exposed. Every creak of the trees, every crunch of gravel outside the gate made me wonder if another car would appear, another stranger stepping onto the porch to claim a piece of what wasn't theirs. The piece I had built, brick by brick and board by board, was being dismantled not by vandals or thieves, but by people who claimed to be my community. Yet the letters kept coming. The fines grew larger, and with each passing week, the pressure mounted, until I realized this wasn't just about money or rules anymore. It was about control. The HOA had chosen me as their example, and they weren't going to stop until I bent or broke. But bending wasn't in my nature. The following week confirmed what I had feared. The HOA wasn't retreating. If anything, they were doubling down. Another envelope appeared, this one with bolder language and a higher fine. It accused me of obstructing community access and creating hostile conditions for prospective buyers. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the absurdity. Prospective buyers? Of what? My life wasn't a showcase and my cabin wasn't theirs to peddle like merchandise. But underneath the laughter was exhaustion. Each new notice was a reminder that they wouldn't stop, not until I either bowed to their demands or lost everything. I stacked the letters in my binder, the pile growing thicker, heavier, like a physical record of their obsession. Soon, the HOA president herself began showing up. Not just at meetings, not just hidden behind letterhead, but in person. She'd appear near my gate with her clipboard, standing stiffly as though inspecting property lines that had been there long before she moved in. Once, I stepped outside to confront her, demanding to know what she was doing. She didn't flinch. She just jotted something on her paper and muttered, "Violations will be addressed." Then she turned and walked away. That phrase, "violations will be addressed," haunted me. It was vague enough to cover anything, yet sharp enough to feel like a blade pressed to the throat. And true to her word, the notices became more aggressive. One claimed my porch railing was a safety hazard. Another declared my firewood stack an unsightly nuisance. They weren't just targeting my gate anymore. They were combing through every inch of my life, searching for any excuse to tighten their grip. The more they pressed, the more determined I became. I spent long nights documenting everything, taking photos of the cabin, dating images of my wood pile, and scanning every letter. I wasn't just fighting to keep my property. I was building a case for myself. Still, the toll was real. The peace that once defined the cabin was slipping through my fingers. What had been a refuge now felt like a battlefield, and I found myself bracing each day for the next attack. The worst came on a rainy afternoon. I had been inside, listening to the steady patter against the roof, when headlights flashed across the window. I stepped outside to find another group of strangers trudging through the mud toward my porch, led by the same realtor I had seen before. My gate had been forced open, the chain hanging loose, broken. Rage surged through me like fire. I stormed forward, my voice cutting through the rain. "This is private property. Get off my land." The strangers froze, startled, but the realtor tried to smooth it over with her bright professional smile. "The HOA assured us this cabin was being prepared for sale. You're trespassing," I snapped, my fists clenched at my sides. "And the HOA doesn't own this cabin. I do." The shock on their faces quickly turned to embarrassment. They mumbled apologies as they hurried back to their car, splashing mud across the gravel drive. The realtor lingered a moment longer, her smile faltering as she realized I wasn't bluffing. She turned on her heel and left without another word, but the damage was done. My gate was broken, my privacy shattered once again, and my trust in the community had evaporated entirely. I repaired the chain that night, tightening it until my hands bled from the effort. As I worked, rain dripping down my face, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't let them take another step onto my land without a fight. Word of the confrontation spread quickly. Neighbors began whispering, some sympathetically, while others were nervous about being seen speaking to me. The HOA president, of course, spun her own version of events. She painted me as uncooperative, hostile, and a threat to community cohesion. Her words were repeated in newsletters, dropped into conversations at the mailbox, weaponized against me. But what she didn't realize was that her overreach was starting to backfire. Some neighbors began asking quiet questions. If the board could target me so aggressively, who was next? The illusion of fairness was cracking, and beneath it the raw abuse of power was plain for anyone willing to look. Still, the pressure didn't ease. Another fine, another notice. This time it wasn't about the gate or the firewood. It was about me, personally. Behavior unbecoming of a community resident. The words chilled me. It wasn't just about property anymore. They were trying to paint me as the problem, to erase my legitimacy in the very place I had built with my own hands. That night I sat at the kitchen table, binder open, staring at the mountain of paper. For the first time, I realized what this really was. Not just harassment, not just petty fines. It was a strategy, deliberate, calculated, meant to break me down piece by piece until I either surrendered or was forced out. And in that moment, staring at the papers that marked months of abuse, I knew something had to change. They had dragged me to the edge. If I wanted to protect my cabin, my refuge, my life, I would have to push back harder than ever before. The next morning, I woke to the sharp rap of knuckles against my front door. It wasn't a neighbor stopping by, nor was it a delivery. When I opened it, two men in tailored suits stood on my porch, their shoes already flecked with dust from the gravel. They introduced themselves as representatives of the board and handed me a thick packet of papers bound with a rubber band. It wasn't just another fine. It was a formal notice of legal action. They claimed I was in repeated violation of HOA bylaws and demanded immediate payment of thousands of dollars in accumulated fines. The packet even included the threat of a lien against my property if I didn't comply. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. It wasn't just bureaucracy anymore. It was war. For a moment, the walls of the cabin seemed to close in on me. The one place in the world I had built with my own two hands, the place that had always felt untouchable, now had a noose around its neck. They weren't going to be satisfied with harassment. They wanted ownership, leverage, and total control. I spent the next hours making phone calls, attorneys, advocacy groups, anyone who could help me make sense of the madness. Most conversations ended the same. Polite sympathy, followed by high hourly rates I couldn't dream of paying. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. I began compiling evidence more rigorously than ever before. Photos of the forced open gate, logs of every trespasser, copies of every single notice and fine. I even recorded myself walking through the cabin and yard, narrating the timeline of events so that no one could twist the truth. Each entry into my binder became fuel, proof that I wasn't the unreasonable one, no matter how loudly the HOA insisted otherwise, but they weren't slowing down. A week later, they escalated again. Without warning, a contractor truck pulled up outside my cabin. Men in reflective vests began unloading tools, heading straight toward the gate. When I rushed out to stop them, they told me they had been authorized by the HOA to perform compliance work, tearing down my gate and beautifying my property. My voice cracked as I ordered them to leave. "This is my land. You don't touch a single thing without my consent." They hesitated. The contractor made a call, muttered something into his phone, then waved his crew back into the truck. But the message was clear. The HOA wasn't afraid to cross boundaries that weren't theirs to cross. And if I hadn't been home that morning, who knows what they would have destroyed. That night, fear gave way to resolve. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to expose them. I reached out to local journalists. I sent anonymous tips to online forums where people shared HOA horror stories. I even considered contacting state officials to investigate the board's abuse of power. Every keystroke, every email was driven by a mix of anger and desperation. They wanted me to crumble in silence, but I refused. The backlash was slow at first, but it soon began to spread. A neighbor slipped me a note at the mailbox, a quiet admission that they too had been harassed over trivial violations. Another confided that they feared the board's president, but admired that I was standing up for myself. And then, the most shocking turn. A retired lawyer who lived 3 streets over knocked on my door. He had heard my story through the grapevine and offered his help. pro bono. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: hope. Together, we combed through the HOA's bylaws, comparing every accusation against the actual rules. Again and again, we found gaps, overreaches, and blatant lies. They weren't just enforcing the rules, they were inventing them. And that realization transformed my fear into fire. The next HOA meeting was my battleground. I didn't sit quietly, in the back, as I had before. I arrived with my binder tucked under my arm and my new ally at my side. When the president called me out of order, I stood anyway. My voice didn't shake this time. I laid out the evidence page after page, violation after violation, and not mine, but theirs. The room shifted. Murmurs spread. Faces that once looked away now stared directly at the board, doubt creeping into their expressions. The president tried to interrupt, to dismiss me, but I didn't stop. And when my neighbor-turned-ally confirmed the legal inconsistencies allowed, the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, I saw the board falter. Their grip on power had cracks. The community they ruled with fear was beginning to know the truth. But as I left that meeting, binder still heavy in my hands, I knew something with chilling certainty. They wouldn't go down without a fight. I had exposed their lies, but in doing so, I had cornered them. And cornered power is the most dangerous kind. The storm was approaching, and the ensuing confrontation would determine everything. The tension had been building for months, and by the time I walked into the HOA boardroom that morning, I knew the battle would either be won or lost in the next few hours. My binder was thick with evidence: letters, photos, logs of trespassers, copies of every unjust fine, even documentation of the realtor-led tours. I carried it like armor, a physical representation of every insult, every intrusion, every attempt to erase my ownership. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and polished wood. Neighbors trickled in, curious and apprehensive, whispering among themselves. I recognized a few familiar faces, those who had observed the harassment from the sidelines, hesitant to speak up before. Now they seemed to sense that something was about to happen, that the rules of the neighborhood were about to be rewritten in real time. At the head of the room stood the HOA president, clipboard in hand, exuding the same cold authority she had wielded so mercilessly over the past months. Her eyes narrowed as I stepped forward, setting the binder on the table with a deliberate thud. The sound cut through the murmurs, silencing the room. "Before we begin with routine matters," I said, voice steady but charged with tension, "I want to address the months of harassment, fines, and unauthorized trespassing that have been directed at me and my property." Her expression didn't change, but the faint twitch at the corner of her eye betrayed her unease. She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't done. I spread the binder open and began presenting evidence chronologically. Photos of the gate being forced open, scanned letters demanding fines for non-existent violations, and notes from neighbors corroborating my account. Each page I turned punctuated the narrative of control and abuse that the HOA had attempted to impose. The board members shuffled uncomfortably. The president tried again, this time cutting in with a sharp, "This is a misrepresentation." "I'm not misrepresenting anything," I interrupted. "This is every letter, every notice, every intrusion documented. If you dispute it, then let's go through it line by line. Otherwise, the room can see the truth." The atmosphere shifted. Neighbors leaned forward in their chairs. Whispers grew into quiet acknowledgement. For the first time, the power dynamic that had defined the community began to crumble. Then, as though on cue, the realtor arrived in the hallway outside, attempting to enter. She paused when she saw me, eyes wide, and I could see the flicker of uncertainty on her polished face. I held her gaze and gestured to the binder on the table, letting the weight of evidence do the talking. She retreated without a word. The president's voice rose, sharp with anger and desperation. "You've turned this meeting into a spectacle. Your refusal to comply with community standards is unacceptable." I leaned forward, letting my anger surface. "Community standards? You've cited rules that don't exist, staged unauthorized tours, and imposed fines for your own amusement. This isn't about rules. This is about control. And it ends here." A hush fell over the room. Even board members who had remained silent looked uneasy. I saw them glance at one another, unsure of how to respond to the pile of undeniable evidence before them. I paused, letting the moment hang. Then I delivered the blow. If these actions continue, I will pursue legal action. And every detail of this harassment will be public record. The community deserves to know the truth. The neighbors deserve to know the truth. And you will be held accountable. Gasps echoed from several attendees. I could feel the tension stretching, almost cracking the air like a taut wire. The president's face paled slightly, and her posture stiffened. For the first time, I realized the effect my defiance had wrought. Her authority, long assumed to be absolute, was faltering. Neighbors began murmuring among themselves. One, a man who had always kept a low profile, finally spoke. We should hear what he's saying. This is serious." Another nodded. "Yeah, maybe it's time someone called this out." I seized the moment. "Exactly. This isn't just about me. This is about every resident here. Every single violation, real or imagined, has a pattern. And that pattern is abuse of power." The president's voice cracked slightly. You have no right." "I have every right," I cut in. "The right to defend my property, my home, and my peace. The right to ensure that those entrusted with governance act fairly and legally. And the right to expose those who have abused that trust." The room went silent. Even the board's lawyer, who had arrived late, looked uneasy as he leafed through the binder. The evidence was unassailable. Every claim I had made, every fine, every intrusion, every trespass, documented and dated. I could feel the weight of months of frustration, anger, and fear pouring out in my words, yet I maintained a clarity that made the argument undeniable. The tension was electric. The board had underestimated me, but now the neighbors, the silent witnesses, were watching, and that realization seemed to sap the president's resolve. I took a final step forward. "You've had your chance to act fairly. You chose intimidation. You chose fines. You chose trespass. And now you will see the consequences of those actions." Her face tightened, lips pressed together. There was a flicker of panic, the thin veneer of control slipping away. I could see it in her eyes, and I knew that the next moments would decide everything. The room held its breath. The confrontation had reached its peak. For months, I had been tested, pushed, and humiliated. Now, the culmination of every document, every witness, every moment of steadfast refusal converged into this instant, a turning point where power shifted, and the homeowner was no longer on the defensive. And in that silence, as all eyes watched, I felt it. The beginning of justice, of vindication, and the collapse of the intimidation that had haunted my cabin for so long. The president's composure faltered further as I began presenting the financial breakdown. Every fine she had imposed, every late fee she had compounded, every administrative cost she had claimed, all meticulously itemized, all clearly unjustified. The board members glanced nervously at one another. It was no longer a meeting, it was an indictment. One of the neighbors, emboldened by my presentation, spoke up. "We've all received letters. Some of us have been afraid to say anything, but this isn't right." Others nodded. The murmurs grew louder. The energy shifted from tension to reckoning. I pressed on. I showed them photographs of the realtor, touring my property without consent, the broken chain on my gate, and the muddy tire tracks across the yard. I described the emotional toll, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, making it personal, undeniable. No amount of bureaucratic language could mask the cruelty and overreach. Then I laid out the final piece of evidence, the legal consultation. I explained that every action taken by the board had been reviewed by an attorney and that the HOA's tactics violated not only their own bylaws, but state property law. The reaction was instantaneous, faces drained of color. The president clutched, her clipboard like a shield, realizing the consequences of the actions she had sanctioned. The room fell silent again. For months, she had wielded authority with impunity, believing her position unassailable. Now, every witness, every neighbor, and every document turned that power into vulnerability. I could see her calculating, trying to find a way out. But the path had narrowed. "Every action you have taken has consequences," I said firmly. "And you are accountable, not just to me, but to this community." The board's lawyer, a man who had spent years defending them, now looked uneasy. He flipped through the binder, shaking his head. "The documentation, it's comprehensive. Legally, it's difficult to refute." A palpable tension filled the air. I could feel the shift, the moment when the predator becomes the prey. The power I had fought to reclaim was now mine. I wasn't just defending property, I was asserting truth. Over deception, transparency over intimidation, then came the public humiliation. A neighbor quietly began recording on a phone, capturing every word, every document laid out on the table. Soon, others joined, creating a chorus of witnesses who had long been silenced by fear. The HOA president realized that her actions, once hidden behind letters and closed doors, were now being exposed to the very community she had claimed to serve. Her face tightened, lips pressed thin. The bluster she had maintained in previous confrontations was gone. She stammered through a feeble attempt to justify her actions, but no one listened. The evidence, the witnesses, the sheer audacity of her own overreach left her trapped. I paused, letting the moment hang, giving the room time to absorb the reality. I could see some board members sweating, others shifting uncomfortably. The veneer of authority had cracked, and the truth was seeping through. Then I made my final move. I reminded them that the legal notices had been drafted and filed, that any further action against me would result in public litigation. I held up the binder, a symbol of months of careful, methodical preparation. "I have documented everything," I said. "Every intrusion, every fine, every misrepresentation, and I will not hesitate to use it to protect what is mine. Do you understand?" The president's voice faltered. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The room seemed to exhale collectively. The neighbors, once timid, now watched with a newfound sense of empowerment. They realized that authority, when unchecked, could be challenged, and that sometimes standing firm was the only path to justice. I knew this confrontation wasn't just a personal victory, it was a turning point for the entire community. By exposing their actions, by presenting irrefutable evidence, I had shifted the balance. The board had underestimated the resolve of one homeowner, and that mistake would have repercussions far beyond the walls of this meeting room. The president finally slumped back into her chair, a defeated posture that contrasted sharply with the confident stance I maintained. The message was clear. The HOA's power, wielded arbitrarily and cruelly, had been confronted and broken, and I had delivered the blow. The tension in the room remained, but it was now filled with anticipation. Neighbors whispered to each other. The board members glanced at their papers helplessly, and I could feel the surge of vindication coursing through me. Months of harassment, intrusion, and intimidation had led to this precise moment. A climax where every move I had made culminated in undeniable authority and moral victory. As I closed my binder and stepped back, I could see the subtle nods. From some neighbors, the quiet looks of respect. The HOA president had been publicly exposed. Her tactics lay bare for all to see, and though the battle wasn't entirely over, the tide had shifted irrevocably. The final moment hung in the air, a quiet, tense acknowledgement that the homeowner had faced the apex of the board's abuse of power, and had prevailed, not just with words, but with preparation, resilience, and unshakable resolve. The following week, the tension escalated further. Armed with the binder and legal counsel, I returned to the HOA office. This time not as a resident pleading for fairness, but as someone fully prepared to hold them accountable. The board's receptionist barely looked up as I entered, her usual polite smile replaced by a trace of unease. I could sense the ripples of my previous confrontation had already begun to unsettle the entire office. The president sat behind her desk, clutching, her clipboard like a shield. Her confident posture from the previous meetings had evaporated. This time, she knew the confrontation was no longer just about words. It was about exposure, legal ramifications, and the undeniable proof of misconduct. I began by submitting a formal complaint to the local authorities and state HOA oversight committee. The folder I placed on her desk contained copies of every notice, every intrusion, every staged tour, all meticulously documented. The weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. I could see her lips press into a thin line as she flicked through the pages, realizing the gravity of what had been compiled. "I've given this board multiple opportunities to act lawfully," I said firmly. "Instead, you've escalated harassment, trespassed on private property, and ignored the rights of residents. The matter is now in the hands of legal and state oversight. I suggest you prepare accordingly." A tense silence filled the office. Then, as if on cue, one of the board members whispered to another, glancing nervously at the documents. I could see the panic spreading, the uncertainty creeping into those who had once stood behind the president without question. Authority, when wielded arbitrarily, suddenly looked fragile. The following days brought more exposure. The local newspaper ran a small piece about HOA dispute escalates, and online forums buzzed with my story. Neighbors I had never met reached out, sharing their own tales of harassment. Each story added fuel to the growing fire, a pattern of behavior so consistent that the HOA could no longer claim innocence or misunderstanding. When the state HOA committee summoned the board for a hearing, the atmosphere was electric. The board sat stiffly, documents fanned out in front of them, while I entered with my binder and my attorney at my side. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was prepared, and months of intrusion, fines, and harassment had led to this decisive moment. As I presented my evidence, the committee members leaned forward, flipping through my organized records. Each violation, each unauthorized intrusion, each fine imposed without legal justification, all laid bare. The board president attempted to speak, but each time she opened her mouth, my attorney calmly pointed out factual inconsistencies. Her voice faltered, her confidence crumbled. One by one, committee members addressed the board with pointed questions. Why were residents being charged fines that are not documented in your bylaws? Why were unauthorized tours conducted without consent? How do you justify the repeated trespassing onto private property? The president's answers were halting, defensive, and ultimately unconvincing. Her veneer of authority, once formidable, now appeared brittle, almost ridiculous. Every attempt to deflect or manipulate the narrative failed. The audience of residents, many of whom had witnessed the harassment firsthand, watched silently, the tension palpable. Finally, I spoke directly, not as a complainer, but as a homeowner, who had endured months of relentless abuse. I described the emotional toll, the sleepless nights, and the constant anxiety. I emphasized that this wasn't just about property lines or rules. It was about power misused and trust betrayed. My voice, calm but resolute, carried across the room. By the time I finished, The board's authority had collapsed completely. The committee adjourned to deliberate, leaving the room thick with anticipation. Residents whispered to each other, acknowledging what they had long suspected. The board's leadership had been abusive, petty, and overreaching. The president sat slumped in her chair, her expression one of utter defeat. When the committee returned, their decision was unequivocal. The fines were invalidated, the liens removed, and the board was ordered to provide restitution for harassment and unauthorized actions. The president and select board members were publicly reprimanded. Their mismanagement, once concealed by bureaucratic language, had been exposed for everyone to see. The room erupted in muted applause. Neighbors approached to thank me quietly. Some admitted they had feared speaking up before, but seeing one person stand firm had given them courage. I could feel a profound sense of vindication, not just for myself, but for the community that had suffered under arbitrary authority. The president avoided eye contact, her clipboard now useless as a symbol of power. She had been publicly humiliated, held accountable, and stripped of the authority she had wielded carelessly. I realized then that the months of frustration, the constant harassment, and the emotional turmoil had led to a transformative moment, a collapse of intimidation and the triumph of truth and persistence. Walking out of the committee chambers, I felt an unshakable sense of relief. The apex of the HOA's abuse had been confronted and decisively defeated. My cabin, my sanctuary, and my life had been defended, not by surrendering or hiding, but by meticulous preparation, unwavering resolve, and the courage to expose wrongdoing. As I stepped into the sunlight, the tension of months lifted slightly, though the memory of the struggle remained vivid. This was the turning point, the climax where all the pressure, fear, and anger coalesced into a moment of triumph. And though the conflict had reached its peak, the story wasn't over. The aftermath, the resolution, and the long-term consequences would soon unfold, proving that standing firm against abuse of power could change not only one life, but an entire community. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered in every corner of the neighborhood. After the formal reprimand and the nullification of the fines, a sense of cautious relief settled over my cabin and the surrounding streets. For months, I had lived under the oppressive shadow of the HOA's unchecked authority, bracing for the subsequent intrusion, the following letter, the next arbitrary fine. Now that weight had lifted, replaced by a clarity and a hard-earned peace that was almost surreal. Neighbors, once hesitant to engage, began approaching me with stories of their own frustrations. Conversations that had previously been polite, but superficial, now delved into the injustices we had collectively endured. One afternoon, as I mowed the lawn near the edge of my property, a couple from 2 houses down walked over, smiling nervously. They thanked me for standing up, admitting that they had feared retaliation if they spoke out. But now, emboldened by the outcome, they shared how the HOA had harassed them over trivial matters, fines that had no legal standing, and notices that seemed to appear overnight without warning. The sense of solidarity was overwhelming. For the first time in months, the community felt less like a battleground and more like a neighborhood. People began meeting on their porches, trading gardening tips, sharing stories, and even laughing in ways that had been impossible while the specter of the HOA's intimidation loomed over every interaction. The fear that had quietly dictated so many behaviors was replaced with cautious empowerment. Meanwhile, the HOA president, once the epitome of control and authority, had been reduced to a figure of quiet humiliation. Her attempts to maintain dominance had crumbled under scrutiny, leaving her authority diminished not just legally, but socially. Even board members who had quietly supported her began to distance themselves, recognizing that complicity in her overreach could carry consequences. It was a profound shift. The structure that had seemed immovable revealed its fragility when confronted with persistence, evidence, and community awareness. The tangible effects of the legal resolution were significant. All fines and liens against my property were formally annulled. Documentation was sent to every resident, clarifying that the HOA's prior actions had been unlawful and emphasizing the rights of homeowners to due process. The board was required to undergo oversight training and implement transparent procedures to prevent further abuse. This bureaucratic shift, while procedural, sent a clear signal. Arbitrary authority would no longer go unchallenged. Emotionally, the outcome was transformative. The months of anxiety, sleepless nights, and constant vigilance had taken a toll. But the sense of triumph and vindication was profound. I could finally inhabit my cabin fully, without glancing over my shoulder or fearing the knock of another unauthorized visitor. The spaces that had once felt fraught with tension, the driveway, the porch, the garden, were now reclaimed. Every corner of the property became a symbol of resilience. Beyond the personal relief, there was a larger ripple effect. Neighbors began questioning the board's decisions more critically, attending meetings with informed eyes, armed with their own documentation. The culture of unquestioned compliance was replaced by accountability. Parents felt safer allowing their children to play outside, couples resumed leisurely walks without the fear of HOA surveillance, and even the casual conversations at the mailbox regained a normalcy that had long been absent. The legal and public exposure had also created a permanent record. Articles in local publications, forum posts, and official HOA communications now document the misconduct. Future board members would be aware that abuse could be challenged effectively, that evidence mattered, and that the community would not remain silent indefinitely. This legacy of vigilance became a shield for all residents, ensuring that the environment would remain fairer, more transparent, and more just. Social dynamics shifted as well. The isolation that had come from the constant scrutiny of the HOA diminished. People began engaging with one another more openly, offering assistance, advice, and support. The shared experience of confronting abuse forged a subtle but powerful bond. Conversations that had been quiet whispers behind closed doors became open discussions about fairness, governance, and community values. A renewed sense of mutual respect and collaboration began to take root. Even the president, though publicly reprimanded, became a cautionary tale rather than an active antagonist. Her attempts to intimidate had backfired spectacularly, and she retreated into a more passive role. Her visibility and influence waned, and her authority was no longer feared. This reduction in her power sent a message to anyone else who might attempt to misuse authority in the future. Accountability is inescapable, and transparency is unavoidable. Personally, I found a sense of closure that had eluded me for months. Sitting on the porch at sunrise, the cabin bathed in soft golden light, I reflected on the journey from harassment to resolution. Every confrontation, every document compiled, every sleepless night had led to this moment of empowerment. The physical space of my home, once threatened, now felt truly mine. And the mental and emotional space, once crowded with anxiety and frustration, had room for calm, reflection, and satisfaction. Yet the resolution carried a broader lesson, one that I often shared with neighbors and friends alike. Standing up against injustice, even when the odds seem insurmountable, can create profound change. Preparation, persistence, and the courage to assert one's rights are powerful tools. And while the battle may be exhausting, the long-term consequences, fairness restored, authority checked, and community trust rebuilt, are immeasurable. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a comfortable rhythm. The cabin felt like a true sanctuary again. I could walk the property freely, tend the garden without anxiety, and even host neighbors for casual conversations or small gatherings. Each interaction carried a subtle undertone of shared history, a reminder that we had collectively faced intimidation and emerged stronger. Looking back, The ordeal had transformed more than the physical or legal landscape. It had reshaped the emotional terrain of the neighborhood. The ripple effect of courage, persistence, and the refusal to submit to arbitrary power became a lasting legacy. Even months later, when new residents moved in, they found a community that valued fairness, transparency, and respect, a community that would not tolerate abuse. And as I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, sunlight streaming across the cabin walls, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey. It was more than just about property or fines. It was about resilience, about claiming dignity in the face of intimidation, and about the quiet but undeniable power of truth. The cabin stood not just as a home, but as a symbol, that standing firm, documenting injustice, and seeking accountability, could transform fear into empowerment. Finally, as the wind rustled the trees and neighbors waved from across the street, I felt a profound sense of completion. The battle was over, the consequences enforced, and the community forever changed. The story, once defined by harassment and fear, had ended with vindication, empowerment, and a clear reminder: authority can be challenged, injustice can be exposed, and one person's determination can reshape an entire neighborhood. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cabin's sturdy walls, I asked myself, quietly but firmly, if one person can stand against abuse and prevail, what limits truly exist for those who refuse to remain silent?